panel today is called India Unbound. The story of India is a fascinating and complex one. It has risen quickly since independence to become one of the new great powers. And I have with me three speakers today who are going to discuss the past, the present, and the future of the country following the partition of the British Indian Empire. Ravi Velloor will be examining the gelling of Indian nationhood and the decade leading up to Narendra Modi. Nisid Hijari takes a closer look at the political and social ramifications of the partition on India today. And Amardeep Singh writes about the displacement of the Sikhs and their heritage in the wake of partition. All this in 45 minutes. That's going to be a challenge, but we'll try our best to fit in as much as we can and hopefully get some Q&A at the end from the audience. I'd just like to briefly introduce our speakers today. Ravi Velloor, many of you must know him already, is Associate Editor at the Straits Times, Southeast Asia's most widely read newspaper. A 36-year veteran in journalism, Ravi's career has spanned Bloomberg News, Time Inc. magazines, Agence France Presse, and United News of India. He is the author of India Rising, Fresh Hope, New Fears, his first book published in Singapore earlier this year. Nisid Hijari is the author of Midnight's Furies, The Deadly Legacy of India's Partition, which won the 2016 Colby Award for Military and International Affairs and Best Book of the Year by NPR. Hijari oversees Asia coverage for Bloomberg View. He was previously foreign editor at Newsweek magazine in New York, as well as a writer and editor for Time magazine in Hong Kong. Amardeep Singh is an engineer with interests in photography, philosophy, and literature. He is the author of Lost Heritage, The Sikh Legacy in Pakistan. Amardeep holds an MBA from the University of Chicago. He spent over 2 decades in financial services, out of which 21 years were at American Express, where he was Asia Pacific Head of Revenue Management. Well, their 3 books they are treasure troves of information, full of vivid descriptions and imagery, and I would urge you all to go downstairs later on and grab a copy of their books, because they're a must-have in your collection. And I'd like to start with you, Ravi, as South Asia Bureau Chief for the Straits Times. You were based in Delhi, and you played a very important role in informing readers in this part of the world about India, the complexities of India. And as your title suggests, India Rising, Fresh Hope, New Fears, I think you've beautifully captured the complexity of India in this title very aptly. I mean, the whole dichotomy that is India. So is this how you perceive India today?
Well, in some it's a positive look on India. A lot of readers, when I was covering India, thought that I was very negative about India. One of them wrote to me that I must have had a very unhappy childhood because, I seemed to be so negative. But the fact was that he wrote to me during that period when things were very stark. Corruption, scandals, everything. The second term of Dr. Manmohan Singh, was a complete contrast to the first, when it was the upliftment, sense of upliftment gave way to despair. And so, what this book tries to do is to portray both sides. The hope part of it is that there are 3 inflection points for India. One is that as a nation, it's really come together after 70 years. At independence, very few people gave it a chance of survival. There was 16, 17 states and so many religions. It was born in bloodshed as an independent nation. And I quote the Yugoslav writer Hijari as saying that in 1960 that he gave India 10 years. But as we know, it's his country that's splintered, not India. It has only added states. It has not lost a single state. Today it's got 29 provinces. So, and it's really come together, through a variety of nations, some of them accidentally. The second point is India's inflection point where the economy is concerned. I think if you look at FDI data, you see the uptake already happening. It's it's just that external winds are very unfavorable at the moment, but even then you see a lot of things happening that is positive. And finally, it's an inflection point for its foreign policy. I really think it is at a strategic sweet spot. That's the hope part of it. The fears are essentially two, as I list here. One, I say that the biggest national security challenge for India is going to be finding employment for its young. There are 600 million Indians below the age of 25, and if you look at below the age of 35, it becomes 800 million. And given the technological changes sweeping, artificial intelligence, it's already seen the software companies' numbers. If you look at automation and roboticization and the whole 3D and reshoring phenomenon that's going on. So it's going to be a big challenge for India. And unless it has the skills, it develops the skills to put things right. And I fear that it is not in a position to do that. And because of that, the so-called demographic dividend could turn into a disaster. So that's one part. The other thing is that I genuinely fear for minority unrest because I've never seen India's minorities being so unsettled.
Ravi, we'll get back to that. I have that as a separate question for you later because that's something very current on people's minds. But I just want to bring Nisid in here. Nisid, you chronicle the events around partition with precision and meticulous detail, and you write, quote, "A few bloody months in South Asia during the summer of 1947 set loose the demons that haunt our world today." And as Ravi mentioned about the bloodshed that happened during that time, and of course the statistics were chilling. I think 15 million people dispersed, hundreds of thousands of people lost their lives. Partition, you believe, is the modern world's least understood tragedies. Why do you say that? I mean, considering how much information we have about partition today.
Well, we have a lot of books out there. There's a lot has been written about it, lots of memoirs, history books, but most have been written from one perspective or the other, from the Indian side, from the Pakistani side. Understandably, many of them were written in the years just after this terrible event, and emotions were very strong, and passion still ran very deep. But there haven't been that many attempts to look at it from a more independent perspective, where you can sort of see the mistakes that both sides made, and that there isn't a single villain that you can point to. Everybody likes to say it's either the other side or the other side and the British that were to blame for this. And in fact, the British made mistakes, the Indian side made mistakes, the Pakistani leaders made mistakes as well. The other reason to say that is that I think it is a little appreciated outside of the region how important that event was to some of the fault lines we deal with today. That part of the world is, when I was at Newsweek, we had a cover story, and the cover line was, we called Pakistan the most dangerous nation in the world. And I got a lot of flack for that. And we weren't trying to say that it was the most dangerous place to walk down the street. What we meant was, it's the place where you have the greatest likelihood of nuclear war breaking out or a nuclear weapon being stolen. And the question is why that is. Why do you have this plethora of terrorist groups sort of floating around in this rapidly growing nuclear arsenal? And the reason is because of the Pakistani military's deep insecurities about India, this paranoia they have about this neighbor that they view as an existential threat. That mindset comes directly out of the experience of partition. And that's why I thought it was important to understand it better.
Thank you. And Amardeep, your 500-page book is full of beautiful photographs and accounts of your journey into the heart of Pakistan in search of your Sikh legacy. And of course, it was a very personal journey for you because your father was born in Muzaffarabad and you grew up listening to stories about that as a child. So you were telling me earlier that you pretty much landed up in Lahore with 3 sets of clothes, a camera, and with no set plan, and things sort of unfolded from there. Were you ever afraid of when you set foot in Pakistan? Did you feel scared?
To be honest, it's before I was going, it's the people around me that were making me afraid. I had a very strong passion, and I had to do this, I felt. And I've written that as my emotions start unfolding, as I was come into the country and start moving from Lahore onwards. And to be honest, less than 24 hours, all that curtain of fear just dropped down. And I say this, I encourage people that my experience in Pakistan was all love and embracing, So I don't know where the political system and media breaks down, but at a human-to-human level, I found only love out there. And I encourage people that go and visit the country. It's a beautiful country. Yes, from an India-Pakistan perspective, 1947 was an aberration. All communities got hit on either side, so we can't blame either side. All communities got hit, right? But we moved on 7 decades onwards. It's only love and affection I see. But yes, there are polarities existing in both the nations. There are goods and bads existing on both the sides, but I guess it's the kind of energy that you emanate is what you'll attract.
Well, glad that you made it back safe and sound, but I believe you're planning another trip very soon, so we'll talk about that in a bit. But Ravi, your book, and I don't like to ask you this question, how are you going to squeeze a whole decade in one answer, but if you had to take away, if you were to describe Manmohan Singh, Prime Minister Manmohan Singh's legacy, what legacy do you think he's bequeathed to the new government of Narendra Modi?
Well, I think on the economy, he left behind a poisoned chalice. And as an economist of repute, he should have done better. But the fact is that communal ties were very good during his 10 years. People felt it belonged. It was, you had a Roman Catholic running the party of governance. You had a Sikh prime minister. When he took charge, Dr. Kalam was the president. Small things, these are symbols, but they matter. And even though all these corruption scandals broke during his time, I don't think personally his image has been sullied. It's just a sense of despair that he could have done better. And maybe if he didn't want to stick to his seat so badly, or maybe if his wife had allowed him to go, which a lot of people think that she was the one who insisted that he'd continue. Plus the fact that I sense that he thought that should he move away, someone worse would come and make things terrible. So I think there were two factors at work. So it's a mixed record. But if I may just go back to the question you asked Amardeep about safety in Pakistan. Safety is anything can happen without you knowing, but it's not that it's inflicted deliberately at you. As a foreign correspondent in Pakistan many times, it was always intelligence watching you. And typically they are on motorbikes. And the most frustrating thing for the intelligence fellow is if you decide to walk, because then he has to move really slowly. So I used to tease these guys by walking, especially in Islamabad. But in other times, I realized that he's doing a job. So many a time I would go to him and say, look, why didn't you give me a ride? So I'd sit on his pillion and go to it because it made his job simpler and mine too.
I want to go back to your book, Nisid, where you've going back to 1947, and we're going to be doing this a lot, going back and forth a bit because of the subjects of the books, but you've vividly brought to life these two central figures who played a very, very crucial and critical role in the whole partition drama, namely Jawaharlal Nehru and Muhammad Ali Jinnah, the founder of Pakistan. And you've talked about how their personal rivalry and their inability to get along really shaped the destiny of the country in many ways. So do you believe that partition could have been avoided? Do you think that a few months before partition, Mr. Jinnah was in any mood to compromise, or that riots perhaps would not have happened if these two individuals had not made all those series of mistakes and decisions that they did at the time?
I wouldn't put it entirely on the two of them. That's a little too much to say. But was partition inevitable? Definitely not. There was a year, people often forget, but a year before partition, in the spring of 1946, both sides agreed to maintain a united India after the British left. Both sides did so reluctantly, Nehru and Gandhi on one side, Jinnah on the other, but the British had come up with this very complicated scheme whereby the areas that eventually became Pakistan would stay within India but have a great deal of autonomy and so on. And everybody agreed to it. Whether it would have lasted or not, nobody knows. It might have resulted in a more chaotic breakup 10 years down the line. we can't say, but there was a moment where political compromise was possible. That particular deal was blown up by Nehru after he
Was that the cabinet mission?
Exactly. So when, as I said, both sides were accepted reluctantly. Nehru, unlike Jinnah, was a very hot-tempered, sort of tempestuous, temperamental person. And at a press conference, he was being pushed on this deal and why he had sacrificed so much, why he had compromised so much. And he said something along the lines of, "Well, don't pay attention to this. Once the British are gone, we'll do whatever we want." And of course, Jinnah couldn't accept that. Even after they agreed to divide the country, though, which was in the spring of 1947, it was still possible that you wouldn't have had violence. The day they announced this, there had been riots, violence occurring all throughout the country for a whole year up to that point. Everything calmed down because people finally had some degree of clarity about what the future was going to hold. So much of the violence between the two sides wasn't about religion, it was just about fear. It was about what's going to happen to me and my family. So once they had a bit of clarity, many parts of the country settled down. The one part that didn't was the Punjab, which was going to be split by the border. All three sides, I think, made mistakes in the Punjab in not preparing for the potential for violence, for not listening to the Sikh community, which was the one who was going to be most affected by this border, and who were threatening to defend themselves and defend their families. So there was a period of several months there where I think that could have been headed off as well. And then just to finish off, even after you had the riots, which as terrible as they were, hundreds of thousands of people were killed, what people also don't remember is that the riots only lasted about 6 weeks. Right? It happened a very concentrated period of violence. What really drove the two countries apart was how these two leaders, Nehru and Jinnah, reacted to the violence and how they started putting machinations in place to take a bit of territory from one of the others. This is how we ended up with the Kashmir problem. It was those political maneuvers that eventually put the two sides in conflict in Kashmir, which is why we ended up where we are today.
You've also said that it was not just Jinnah and the British, but equally Mahatma Gandhi, and that's a controversial thing, that he was somewhat to blame for what happened.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think most Indians wouldn't like to hear anything bad said about Gandhi. And this isn't. I'm not. I don't say in the book that he had any malign intentions, but you have to remember that Gandhi's sort of peak of power and political influence was 20 years earlier. By the time partition happened, he was in his 70s. There are many people who actually thought he had gone a little bit senile. And even if that wasn't the case, he was very rigid politically and really wasn't looking to compromise with Jinnah at that point. And there were various moments where I think a strategic compromise could have deflated the demand for Pakistan. Gandhi, because he was following his own sort of principles and so on, refused those compromises. And then the other thing is, I don't think he appreciated the influence he had on ordinary Indians. This is something that going to Ravi's point about minorities today, you have to be very careful as a leader what you say, because you don't know how your words can be interpreted. So there are things that Gandhi would say about defending Hindu women, for instance, that were taken at the ground level as incentive to go massacre Muslims, right? as in retaliation for crimes that he thought had been committed, that Gandhi was apparently confirming. And this is not something that he clearly didn't want this to happen, but exactly, you have to be very careful.
Amardeep, you mentioned, it's in your book that after partition, we're talking about, again, 1947 and then subsequent generations, they went quiet after partition. You've talked about that in your book, how historical traumas like partition produce an entire generation that doesn't want to talk about it. And then the second generation, they felt lost. And you belong to the third generation, and you were interested in going out there and finding answers to what happened to your family. And did you find those answers?
So actually, I'm the second generation because the age gap between my father and me was quite large, but I consider myself as the third generation because that's where I fit in. There is a study that's happened in one of the US universities which says whenever conflicts happen, and you know what the best example is, look at the Syrian conflicts that's happening right now. and the world was in conflict, world is in conflict, world will be in conflict, we know that, right? But the Syrian conflict that's happening right now asks the Syrians 7 decades from now what happens, right? So the study in US actually says that it's really the third generation which starts asking questions, right? And if you look at the Jew communities when they were displaced, look at the Sikhs, many others, which have strong identities, and I personally felt that's what really happened to me in embarking on this journey. And you've got to look at a bit of a background to this, because when I was growing up, my quest into my community's history was quite influenced by the events of 1947. What my dad used to talk to me over the dining table, sitting in the outside, and he had come to a new land. He was from Kashmir, up in the hills, what he described as a Shangri-La, and now he was right in Uttar Pradesh, in a harsh climate, hot, and he would sit in the mornings and he'd say, what, today I'm remembering of Muzaffarabad, and he would have tears in his eyes, right? So he could never go back to that land. So I kind of was impacted by that, and as I grew up, I started delving into the history of my community. And what dawned on me was that prior to the British coming into India, the last empire that was left, I'm talking about 1849, when India was never like what it was today. It was many countries, I would say, it's like all guns, right? And many states could have been potentially, right? So British integrated it in some ways. But the last state that was left was the Sikh kingdom, which was from Amritsar right up to the Afghanistan border, from Kashmir, Ladakh, right down to the Sindh border. It was a large place, and the British have written that the toughest of the wars that they fought was against the Sikhs. And 1849 they take over the empire, and 1947 when they leave, that's nearly 100 years later, as Nisid said, and Sikhs were a very important part in the dynamics of Punjab. The question is, a Sikh empire now has no place 100 years later when the British are leaving, and they divide the country in religious lines, and I just couldn't understand how can you divide a nation on religious lines. And certainly the Sikhs are the most impacted party. So the entire heritage, the entire culture, we've seen ourselves getting marginalized into other communities, losing our language, culture, value systems. And this was always as a question as to where are the footprints of my heritage, my community lying, because no one has gone back into the nation for 7 decades. That's what kind of led me to this.
I just want to add a footnote to what Amardeep just said. In 1992, December, I traveled to Pakistan. There was a book on partition called ASHWIN'S Train to Pakistan. It's a classic, bad book, but it's a great seller. But terrific story. So I wanted to relive that. So I took a train to Pakistan, and I went back to all the spots.
When was this?
92 December. And to come back to that, if you look at the records of the partition, and I did, you would see that the districts with the most violence, that Punjab was the last to get violence. But violence was everywhere else first before it came to Punjab. And secondly, districts where British administrators were the DM, district magistrate, or now they call it district collector, had the most violence. Meaning, it was almost like they let some of it happen. I don't know this.
No, actually, it's interesting because that criticism came up at the time in 1947. People were already talking about this. The explanation, there was an investigation, and the explanation, which is plausible, is that they had put British officers in charge of the districts that they expected the most trouble to be in, the ones along the border, or where the border that were the most mixed, where you had the biggest militia presence and so on. So it was a sort of chicken or egg thing. And there were definitely some British officers who, at that point, just wanted to leave, right? They were worried about their pensions, they were going home to the UK, they were fed up, they were disappointed. The Punjab, in many ways, was the product of British India, right? It was where a lot of the army came from, and it was a place where, up until partition, all three communities got along quite well, Hindu, Muslims, and Sikhs, and they got along quite well because they shared power, and they focused on bread and butter issues, on pay for soldiers, and on agricultural policies and so on. They weren't talking about politics, they weren't talking about religion. And it all fell apart very quickly under the influence and pressure of Jinnah on one side and the Communist Party on the other, politicizing this population. So they were very disappointed. There were a lot of very disillusioned British officers at that point.
Yeah. Can I just add one thing on that? So it's a good point to make, because the communities were, prior to this whole thing getting instigated, were living together. And if you look at, and my work is more on the heritage, architecture, as I'm seeing 7 decades later, and trying to piece together how communities living that time. That's what I'm trying to do, right? And Punjab.
How many Sikhs are there in Pakistan?
I'll just come to that one. So, Punjab had about 51% Muslims and 49% Sikhs and Hindus together. Sikhs were 18%. And when I look at the Sikh lens inside this book and look at the architectural imprints out there, I find Allah out there, I find the Hindu gods, goddesses, I find footprints of the Sikh inscriptions. It just shows how the communities were living together. And one fine day, someone comes from outside, decides to do something, and we all fell into it.
A man named Cyril Radcliffe. I think you described that whole period very well. So here was this British guy who didn't know anything about India, and he was given this task of drawing a line across lands he'd never been to. So do you think, at the time, those leaders really were aware of what lay ahead? Did they realize the gravity that one line is going to plunge the entire country into mayhem?
The interesting thing is it wasn't the line. Everybody likes to blame Radcliffe, right? It's called the Radcliffe Line, and it's true, he had never been to India before. He never went to where the border was. He drew this line from Delhi. And so it's an easy thing to think, well, clearly the British screwed this up because they just arbitrarily drew this line. The thing is, everybody knew where the line was going to go. The British had a year before done a study of where you would draw a border if you just use census figures. What they decided was districts that are majority Muslim would be on one side, districts that are majority Hindu and Sikh would be the other. They were using census figures that everybody knew about. And the line that they drew 1 year before was almost exactly the same as the one where it ended up. So whether it would have been, a half mile this way or that way would not have made a difference at all. The question wasn't geographical, it was political. Once they decided that they would split Punjab, and remember, Jinnah didn't want to split the province. He said, if you split the province, everyone's going to fight. Keep it whole, but just put it in Pakistan. And it was Congress, it was Nehru and Gandhi who said, no, you can't take it all. You have to, you get to keep the half that's majority Hindu. Again, that might have been okay if anyone had paid attention to the Sikhs, but the Sikhs, earlier that year, there had been a massacre of Sikhs by Muslims in the Punjab. Something like 7,000 people were killed. And so there was a lot of fear, there was a lot of anger, there was desire for retaliation. This was all bubbling up there. And Sikh leaders were saying to both sides, you need to have a solution to this. The reason they didn't, Jinnah didn't take them seriously. He didn't really have good connections in the community, and so he sort of didn't believe that they would fight. Nehru and the Congress may have believed it, but they also thought it was a bit useful to them to have this threat, because they thought that maybe Radcliffe would draw the line over here to give more Punjab to India to avoid violence. Of course, he did it in the end. And then the British, Mountbatten, who was in charge of security.
And he had a mandate of 3 months to do this whole job.
Yeah, exactly. They did rush it, but he thought, he had just been the Supreme Allied Commander of Southeast Asia during the war. After the war had ended, British troops in Indonesia and Vietnam had been fighting sort of insurgencies in both places. And he thought, I'll just do the same thing. We'll just throw some planes, some tanks in there, we'll intimidate them, and they won't fight. They'll be too scared to do this. And of course, even if you did have tanks, they couldn't drive all over the countryside trying to find little bands of 50 people going off and setting a village on fire. So the security wasn't adequate either. But so there was a lot of blame to go around, but ironically, I don't think that much blame should be attributed to Radcliffe.
Ravi, I want to come back to India Rising. You've provided a chilling account of the 2008 attacks on the Taj in Mumbai. You were there at the hotel and you witnessed. It must have been a very, very difficult assignment for you, because you had a personal friend involved, and as well as the lady from Singapore who was involved in these attacks. But at the same time, it gave you insights into Pakistan's terror infiltration network, which you write in detail about. Were you surprised by how deep into Indian territory they have penetrated? Were you surprised by the colossal failure of Indian intelligence in preventing this from happening?
You know, I told you about this train ride to Pakistan in '92. I shared a ride with, in my compartment was a man from the so-called visa section of the Pakistan embassy who was also going back. And within half an hour I knew he was more than a visa officer. And I was surprised at the level of detail that he had about Muslim communities across India, including in my home state, which is in the very south of India, which is in Kerala, and in Madhya Pradesh and all that. They had such detailed information. The fact is that both countries know each other very well, and they can do things to each other. You know, in fact, a lot of people in Pakistan, not a lot, some people believe that that school attack, in which 135 children were killed, may have had something to do with an external power, because that happened on the day, December 16th, on which Bangladesh broke away from, you know, which was done with Indian help. You know, may not be accurate, but you know, the coincidence is there. So, you know, I wouldn't blame just one country. And now, you know, the Indian Prime Minister himself has stood up and suggested that he is in contact with people from Balochistan. So, you know, I mean, of course, the Pakistani deep state is dangerous, pervasive. I mean, this is the country that Osama bin Laden was hiding in, you know, within engulfing terms, you know, a 9-9 distance of the military academy. So, but to come back to Kashmir, the first time that they used irregulars was in Kashmir in 1948. It goes back to that. And to take another step back, because we talked about what leaders were thinking at that point. You know, Jinnah left behind a big mansion on Janpat, which is called Queensway partition. And he did that because I assume that he assumed that after partition, they'd be able to come and live there like it was before. Why would I leave such a big mansion behind otherwise? But now I think it's with the Italian embassy or something like that, right? And just after partition, Jinnah was dying of, you know, I think this book also speaks about his tuberculosis, right? His suffering. He wanted to go, his doctor told him to go to Kashmir and rest there in the thing. And he told Maharaja Hari Singh, he said, I want to come and take some months rest there. And Hari Singh told him, you're not welcome. And that caused, you know, we have a Kashmiri sitting here, you know, I don't know if you agree with me, but that also may have triggered the Pakistani response to use irregulars in Kashmir, you see. So both sides, it's a massive story there, you know, and it keeps playing out every few years, that cycle of violence returns. So that's why in this book, I'm very negative about the Pakistani relationship. But I think, you know, for instance, compared with the China relationship, I don't think China is an enemy state, but I think Pakistan is an enemy state. China is a strategic rival, but it's not an enemy state. That's what I see.
70 years on, we've not been able to put away the ghosts of partition, and as Ravi said, the tensions continue to escalate. How do you feel about prospects of peace, for peace?
Not great. It's, you know, on paper, as you said, if you go to Pakistan, there's nothing but friendliness, right? The cultures are the same. These two countries have more in common with each other than any other two countries on Earth, even the U.S. and Canada. But there's, I mean, there are two things. There is the mindset that is prepared to see the other as the enemy, and that goes back to partition. That goes back to the way partition is taught. You know, people have grown up to learn to think of the other as an enemy that is actively trying to undermine their state. And then, but you know, it also really has to go back to the Pakistani deep state and the Pakistani military in particular. You know, you can say that it's cynical, this view that India is an existential threat, because if that's true, That means they can demand a huge portion of the budgets. That means they can demand aid from external powers and so on. It means that they can seize power whenever they want as the defender of the nation. So it's going to be very, very hard to change the Pakistani military's attitude and mindset. And unless you change that, it's going to be hard to improve the relationship. The problem is, the only people who can change that mindset are Pakistanis. Indians, there's nothing India can do. There's no threats that they can make. They can't isolate Pakistan diplomatically and economically enough to change that mindset. It's going to have to come from within. And a lot of the things that India is doing right now that play well at home, that play well on nationalist TV stations, are actually undermining support in Pakistan, and they undermine the same people, the liberal-minded people that you would want to combat the Pakistani military.
Well, I'm optimistic. I see hope. I see hope because what I've experienced, right? I think as a Punjabi, I mean, keep our religions aside. As a Punjabi, both the sides were impacted. Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs were impacted, right? I see more common in terms of our language, our food habits, our cultures, our poetry, our saints, our spirituality. There's more in common. And it pains me, you know what, because for years, I was conditioned into the same believing, you know, as what the masses believe about hatred, about divisions, about we got to kill each other. 1947, there was this Kashmir aggression. Yes, our communities got impacted, moved out. Then you had the war in the 60s and the 70s, and then you had the Kargil war. We've been conditioned with that hatred, right? But when I actually went to Pakistan, my hope actually resides in the fact that if you connect with people at grassroots level on culture, arts, commonalities, I think there is hope. Because every Pakistani that I've met up with wants to actually get into India, wants to know more about India. I can tell you this much, that as a Sikh walking on the streets, I would have told them, stop offering me food because my stomach's gonna bust. I mean, stop talking to me. I've just got one tongue and I've got just one brain. I can't talk so much, but everyone wants to be around you. So I only see love and affection, so I have hope.
And you also went to Abbottabad, the
Yes,
place
I
that
did.
got notoriety for housing Osama bin Laden. What was
Yeah.
that experience like? Apparently, there's been no Sikh who's been there since 1947. I think that's what you've written in your book.
Oh, so let me at least one of the questions you asked earlier, how many Sikhs are there and then I'll come to the Abbottabad. Well, when the partition happened, Punjab on both the sides got cleansed. Muslims from East Punjab got wiped out. Hindus and Sikhs got wiped out. So I don't call it as division of India, I call it as division of Punjab. Sindh got lost totally to Pakistan. The communities moved out. So Punjab was ethnically cleansed. The Sikhs kind of pushed away towards the Afghanistan border. And these were not Punjabi Sikhs, they were Pakhtun Sikhs, the Pathani Sikhs, right? And they are actually the ones who were left for years. Because Khyber area, Khan Abdul Ghaffur Khan did not want partition to happen, right? So they were kind of protected beyond Peshawar up till Afghanistan. That number today is about 10,000 Sikhs. Generally in Pakistan, family planning is not great, right? So they have about 4 to 5 children. So I would say every family unit has 6 people. We're talking about 10,000 divided by 6. We're talking about 1,500 families. That's what exists in terms of Sikhs. But then, how do you define a Sikh? I always ask this question, because the moment you come down into Sindh, Sindh, contrary to what people believe, has a large Hindu population. It's not polarized. It's a large Hindu population residing there. And every Hindu there is a believer of the Sikh gurus. So how do you define a Sikh is the question I would ask, right? So I think that was the earlier question. Sorry, I didn't complete.
Abbottabad, your
Abbottabad, right? So
experience there.
coming down to Abbottabad experience, my mother was from Abbottabad. My father was from about 40 kilometers further up, Muzaffarabad, where the first attack in 1947, October 21st, happened when the tribals of Pakistan actually came inside and killed and massacred a lot of Sikhs and Hindus there. So for me, going to Muzaffarabad was like, I wanted to go and touch the soil there. It's like something I owed to my parents, owed to my dad for the kind of stories he used to talk about, very emotional journey that I had to make. And Abbottabad was on the way. So yes, there was this fear in my mind of the establishment as I get into the Abbottabad region because of the so-called worldly fear of Osama bin Laden and so on and so forth. But you know what? I was very focused. I had nothing to do with politics. I had nothing to do with anything else. Mine was a quest on what is there in terms of the remnants of a community that has lost its footprint into this land. And I just felt very comfortable. In fact, I stayed in the locals' home there. Interestingly, a family who were Sikhs, and they chose to stay back, and many who stayed back had to adopt Islam. So they had adopted Islam, and in fact, I had told them 2 days before that I'm a vegetarian. And interestingly, they didn't make any non-veg food for 2 days, and I said, that's not what I said. You could have eaten what you wanted, just serve me something separate. But that's the kind of love that they showed, that 2 days they didn't cook any. So I said it was a great experience, I would say.
So on one hand, we have Amardeep stories, and then on the other hand, we're talking about rising intolerance in our country. And you talk about that in your book, Ravi, about how there is a growing intolerance. There's a lot of people feeling very insecure, as you mentioned. Has Narendra Modi polarized the country? Because on one hand, while his economic agenda is going full steam, can he keep his extreme right-wing party in check?
When he was Chief Minister of Gujarat, he managed to do that. There have been instances where even Hindu temples have been demolished to make way for roads. But he was in complete control of the state, and he could do that then. Right now, his agenda is to control as much of India as possible, so that he gets control of the upper house as well. And at least in his first year, I think he faltered. I think he made some blunders. There was this thing about, in Hindi it's called Ghar Wapsi, which means coming home, homecoming or whatever it is, to bring some communities back into the Hindu fold. On Christmas Day 2014 was celebrated as Good Governance Day. So, as I said, little things matter, symbols matter, especially for minority communities, because minority sentiments are always watchful, and they tend to see hurt even when it's not intended, so you have to be doubly careful on how you handle them. And I think he made a few mistakes. When that Muslim man was lynched 50 kilometers outside of New Delhi for supposedly keeping beef in his fridge. It didn't even turn out to be beef, it was goat meat. He was rather silent for a long time. This is a very voluble Prime Minister who gets on Twitter at the drop of a hat. That's what I said in my book as well. If you really want to be Emperor of all India, you have to be Emperor of all Indians. And you can't even come close to being a Nehru or even a Vajpayee if you don't have that vision. I was slightly heartened to see that when it came to the Assam elections, he had reduced that rhetoric a bit. Whether it's because of local factors or not, I saw some signals that maybe he's picking up on that message. Because you can't control India even if 0.1% of its minorities really want to cause you harm. It's as simple as that.
Nisid, do you have a...
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I think partly he appreciates now that he made a political mistake early on, that by allowing his more hardcore supporters to go out and conduct these campaigns and these lynchings and so on, he didn't criticize them because he needs these people himself as for electoral support. But it gave the opposition, the Congress Party, which had been crushed in the elections and really was disorganized, it gave them a stick to start taking to him. And that's what derailed some of his major reforms in the upper house, so the GST, they were able to completely stymie all debate about it in the upper house. So I think he's realized that it is a distraction from his economic goals, from his foreign policy goals. It makes him look terrible abroad. And so whether or not, it's hard to say how he feels personally about Indian Muslims.
He doesn't say much.
He doesn't say much. People who know him don't necessarily have great things to say, but you can't prove anything one way or the other. And what really matters is how he behaves as a leader. And you know, if it's for purely utilitarian reasons, he has a lot of good reasons to stop this sort of thing. But the worry is there are places where he may help him. So you have these elections in UP coming up, and I wouldn't be surprised if the rhetoric starts to heat up again and so on. And the problem is, everybody always thinks they can control this, right? If you're, you know, he thinks he can turn it up in UP, turn it down again later, but it spreads, it infects the media, it infects people in other parts of the country that aren't taking part in the elections. It hardens feelings, it creates fear. This is, again, this is everything that happened in 1947. It was not really about religion, it was about communities, and it was about hatred and fear spreading and being spread by political leaders. So I think he imagines himself as this very strong, powerful leader. He likes to see himself that way, and he is to a certain degree. But I don't think he can control everything that he's unleashed, and that's a worry.
Ravi, at the same time, you also talked about this growing Indianness in your book. Tell us what you mean by that. Is that you mean a blurring of regional lines, regionalism, and people coming together as being Indian?
That's right. You know, I mean, as I said, you know, nobody could ever imagine that this country would hold together at birth, because there were, I think, 16 official languages itself. You know, am I right? 16 official languages, maybe 1,600 dialects or more. So many linguistic divisions. I mean, who could ever imagine that this country would come together? But a few things happened, and you know, I mean, one of them was the Indian Army, which is completely secular and drew from everywhere. It was truly a meritocratic army. Civil services were, you know, drawn from across the country, and particularly the central civil services, the police and the Indian Administrative Service. They would, the deployment in every state ensured that only half would come from that state, and the half were out-of-town people. And there was always this flow between the federal government and the state government, you know, constant thing. So that was one thing. And then 1962 happened when the Chinese attacked India. There again, coming back to Nehru's whimsicality and his tempestuousness, where he said, "Oh, I asked the general to throw the Chinese out of that," you know, and he got a bloody nose. And then you know what happened. But what happened was, although this conflict took place way in the northeast and in Kashmir, across India, it was a big shock. So even in southern India, there were women who were taking off their marriage ornaments, you know, this the thing they wear to show they're married, and gifting it to the state in the war effort. That was something that brought them together as a first shock. And then rationing of the 60s, food shortages. You know, one of the ways you get to know each other is through food, right? And during the food shortages of the 60s, what happened was, you know, the South particularly is a rice-eating area. In the public distribution system, the food rationing, you also began to get wheat, which is called atta, wheat flour, you know. So those who are making, you know, in Singapore people know the word dosa, right? Dosa. It's made from, it's lentils and rice. They innovated and started making dosa with wheat flour, you know. So, you know, food became a thing. And then in the 70s, Mrs. Gandhi introduced this thing called leave travel concession, which meant that every year you could go back to your home village if you were a government servant using on government money, you know. But once in 4 years, you could travel to any part of India. And naturally, the guys wanted to maximize the benefit and would travel across the place. So the guys coming from the south, in Amardeep's old area of Kashmir, would travel all the way up to the north, and when they came down, they found dosa and you know, coffee waiting for them, you see? And that blended things. So a series of happy accidents contributed to that initial thing. Then, of course, cricket and volleyball. So today, you know, I mean, the big consumer product companies like Procter & Gamble and Unilever can get their message across the nation by using Sachin Tendulkar, the cricket star, or Shah Rukh Khan, the you know, and some of the biggest names in music today, including A.R. Rahman, who's won the Oscars. Rahman is actually from the south. He is convert to Islam, and these small things, they send little pulses across the nation, and they come together. And a lot of people have misread India. They thought that they compare it with other nations, civilizational nations, and see that they're all common ground. But in this diversity has come a certain unity, which is I think.
And that's what I wanted to conclude by saying was we've got diversity very well represented on our panel. We've got Keralite, Gujarati from the north, and Maharashtrian, and many people would think that a Keralite and maybe a Sikkimis have nothing in common, or a Maharashtrian and a Punjabi, but there we go.
Yeah, I must add that I'm a green card Punjabi. My wife is Punjabi.
I think we have a few minutes to open it up for questions. So if we have any questions from the audience.
Maybe I'll ask the question. You were talking about the future between the two countries, and Amardeep was more optimistic and you were less optimistic. As Ravi said, I am a Kashmiri. I personally feel that until the Kashmir problem can be sorted out, we are really not going to have peace. It's a festering sore, and it's a continuing problem between the two countries. Pakistan, it's almost like a raison d'etre. They have to say, I mean, the K in Pakistan originally was for Kashmir, as in the nature of Singapore. So unless they can sort out the Kashmir issue one way or the other, I don't think we're going to have permanent peace.
I totally agree with that. It is, I should add that I'm long-term optimistic because I think the forces pulling these two countries together are strong and will eventually get there, but you do have to solve this. But it is, the thing about Kashmir is everyone knows the solution. Right? Nobody wants to admit it, but Pakistan controls about a third of the original Kashmir now, India controls about a third, the most valuable third, and China controls about a third up in the mountains. The fact is, nobody is going to get an inch more of Kashmir than they have right now. And we all know this. China's going to get to keep its part, India will keep its part, Pakistan will keep its part. And we just have to get to that. We have to be able to say that out loud and talk about it. And they've come very close to a deal that would acknowledge that. I mean, just in 2007 under Musharraf. You need to have a strong leader in both countries at the time, right? If Modi had been in power in 2007 dealing with Musharraf, it's possible that deal would have gotten done. But it takes leaders strong enough to do it. It takes pressure from the public who wants it to happen. And the Pakistani army is going to have to accept that it is an army and not a state, and that it can't keep using this issue to put itself at the center of the Pakistani state.
So my sense is that if you look at, if history teaches us anything to look into navigating the future, then 70 years since partition is a very small window that we're seeing right now. And history teaches us 100, 200 years, boundaries change, nations change. We may be getting into a static mode in the modern world, I don't know. But if I look back at the history, I still have hope anything can happen. We are only complicating the problem. Kashmir is one end. Now, Ravi said Balochistan, India's part, is coming inside that now. So you know what, it's a tick for tat. And I feel unless we don't go back to the human values, we connect with people on an individual basis on what's common between us, the hope's going to come from there. And that's what we do. Break the barriers of religions, break the barriers of boundaries, connect into the culture, arts and other things. And that's where you connect with people. And that's where when I've gone to Pakistan, I've traveled to 36 places around in Pakistan. And everywhere I've just seen hope. I mean, it depends on what are we talking about. If I'm going to talk about Kashmir in Pakistan, sure, I'll not come back, right?
I think the other thing that we do need that would help is trade. You need to lower the borders to economic cooperation between the two countries, because once you do that, you need to create a constituency on both sides of the border that has more invested in peace than in conflict. Right now, nobody's making money off of peace. It just, it's something nice to talk about. You have student exchanges and cultural exchanges, but you need actual money flowing back and forth, businessmen crossing back and forth, businesses on both sides of the border. That will slowly build up a cushion so that when you do have another terrorist attack, which you will have, at least then there will be people pushing for calm rather than jumping immediately to raise their guns.
I think as Amardeep said, people-to-people contacts have to be much more overpowering than, I think all the efforts that have happened in the past have just not been able to catch on, and they've sort of petered out.
My experience, I mean, which is the 55th time I'm speaking since Jan, my book has got released. It's been amazing, and the pinnacle of my success, I would say, is when I was in Vancouver, and I was speaking at the audience, and after I spoke, there's this one Muslim man, he came, he says, he spoke in Hindi, and I'll translate, he says, Sardar ji, aap hamari masjid mein bolenge. Amardeep, will you come and speak in our mosque? I said, I'll drop everything else and I'll come to your mosque first. And he organized a session there of 220 people. I felt as a Sikh standing in the podium of the mosque and speaking and delivering this thing, it's like a willingness from their side, willingness from my side. That's how we have to come together.
Do we have any other questions?
Thank you. I enjoyed myself so much. But just this thing about Pakistan being so very dangerous, I'm afraid I cannot agree with you more. Just 2 points. One, I always find it very strange that political analysts that don't seem to bother to mention this. You see, when Pakistan first announced that they have tested a nuclear weapon, the Pakistani authorities announced that they have tested 2 bombs. The only thing is, seismological institutions all the way from Sweden to Australia said that only 1 detonation took place. What happened to the other one? Apparently it turned out that the other bomb didn't go off. You're still buried somewhere in the test site. So if any of you are keen to get a nuclear weapon, all you got to do is take a shower, go there, dig and dig and dig, and if the radiation doesn't kill you, hey, you got a nuclear bomb that is sitting there and waiting for you to collect, And the other thing is this, it's to me, it's an act of grave ineptitude. I don't know what to say, It's a sitting nuclear bombs buried somewhere there. The other thing is this, years ago, I can't remember how many years ago, we had a Christian gathering in Singapore and we used a church premises they allowed us to use. And amongst the delegates were delegates from Pakistan. I stress, it's a Christian gathering. So all these delegates from Pakistan were leaders in their different congregations and supposed to belong in the truth and whatnot. There was a display of flags in the church. There was so much agitation from Pakistani delegates because there was an Indian flag. There was no Pakistani flag to balance things off. Oh Lord.
So what was your question?
So you see, the point is this, and at the end of the day we found that the church put up an Indian flag and many other flags because they managed to set up a church in India and they haven't got out to set up a church in Pakistan, that's all. And they were so upset, and these are Christians. I mean, the big fight I would have thought between Pakistan and India is really between the Hindus and the Muslims really. But the intensity of feeling is unreal. It's unreal. I tell you honestly, you should witness this. I mean, I'm very pleased to hear from Mr. Majid about your very warm experience you had in Pakistan. But my experience I had was, wow, how do you get so angry? Wow.
Do we have time for one more quick question? One last question from anyone? Yes, we have one in the corner there.
Actually, I've heard, historically speaking, the best way to unite cultures or unite nations, few things are sports, exchange of arts, and healthy competition, healthy debate. We of course know sports. Cricket is a major thing across India and Pakistan. That divides us definitely, but it does unite us, in a way. But I want to know what's the art scene between India and Pakistan? The obvious one is Bollywood, but apart from that, is there any other exchange? Is there anything else that you guys can elaborate on?
Well, let's look at the commonalities of arts that once existed, right? Let's start from there, because where we are here right now, we are kind of miles and poles apart, right? The best example I can give you is, because the divisions that we've created, because this line that's got created, there's more in common than differences, at least from Punjab I can say. On this side, in East Punjab, close to Firozpur border, there's this Ganda Singh Wala border, right? It's not an accessible border. You cross on that other side, just 10 kilometers from there lies the mausoleum of Baba Bulle Shah. Now Baba Bulle Shah is the man who wrote about common Punjabi poetry that resonates with Muslims, Hindus, Sikhs, with a humanity, right? Irrespective of whoever it is, you translate it in English, it'll appeal to your soul, right? So on this side of the border, in Punjab, in East Punjab, Bulle Shah is forgotten. The generations today in my community don't even know who Bulle Shah is. They don't even know who Baba Farid is, and vice versa. On the other side, they don't know who Nanak was, or who other the Hindu saints are. So the point is, unless we come together, we create so much of wedge that it'll take a lot of effort to come together. And that's why I remain optimistic. We've got to meet at least and talk amongst themselves. And we are sitting in countries outside. We can actually be the catalyst to change, right? Because outside, we don't have these barriers. Pakistanis and Indians can get along very well. Let's start the change from outside.
Hey, bro, I got to correct your figures on the Pakistani bomb. On the Pakistani bomb thing, because I think the Pakistani explosions were followed the Indian explosions in 1988.
Yeah,
absolutely.
And they did a few weeks later, or a few months later, or whatever. If I remember, the Indians did 4 blasts. And there's no way the Pakistani will do less than 4. I think he did 1 more. So it's not 2, I think there were 5 of those blasts. You know?
Oh, what I meant was the very first blast they announced that they did 2 detonations. Only
Yeah.
1 detonator.
Yeah, maybe, I don't know. I mean, there's all kinds of things. Even the Indian, one of them was called a fizzle by one of the scientists himself. Doesn't matter. But to come back to the thing about the cultural thing, I think there's always this talk about India, Pakistan, and Hindu, Muslim, and all that. I think we are also missing a point that Muslims themselves Islam itself is under great stress. And within Pakistan also, you know, because the Sufi strain of the faith, the non-Sunni, Ahmadiyyas, for instance, are not even recognized as part of Islam in Pakistan. So you should see the strain within Islam itself, and that's very severe. I think sometimes you miss that.
Just one last thing about the culture. It is very important. There are musical exchanges, things like that. But that's also why it's so critical what's happening right now. Just in the last few weeks, there have been these bans in Bollywood on Pakistani musicians, actors working in Bollywood. Concerts have been canceled. Films have been pulled out of film festivals.
That's exactly why I asked this.
Yeah, no, it's silly. It's completely counterproductive. It does absolutely nothing to prevent another terror attack. All it does is cut off some of the few places of exchange that currently exist. And it undermines the people on the other side of the border who should be your ideological allies, the people who have the most invested in tolerance and in exchange and in learning about India and so on. These are artists. These are not terror masterminds or anything. And the more you cut off these connections, the harder it is to build them back again. It's completely pointless.
India had this generosity and towards culture, and we were a melting pot. And this would be a huge setback, I would think, to escalate what's happening now. I think I've been told that we've run out of time, but I just wanted to conclude by saying that I found a common thread in all your 3 books, and that was your powerful personal narrative and the strong passion. I mean, you can see that you poured your heart and soul into your books, and it's no longer just a book; it's a journey. It's posterity. It's generational. So I think you've really enriched a whole generation of readers with your books. So I'd like to thank you for that, and let's give them a big round of